All right, so my M1 Max are already stupid fast. I was amazed by the performance, but this new M1 Pro is how much faster?
Up to 70% faster CPU performance than M1.
And they made a Max version of this. This is gonna be awesome. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to another tech video, the second of the two I have planned for today, and this is probably one of the most exciting Mac events I've seen in a long time, and I'm super excited to talk about it because we don't have just one new chip, we have two new chips. This is gonna be freaking awesome. So let's get started. So before we dive into the Macs that were announced at this event, we're gonna talk about the chips inside because these are big. So first things first, everybody got the naming wrong. We thought that they were gonna be the M1X or the M2, but they went with M1 Pro and M1 Max. And sure, I mean, you got the Pro name for the phones, but then you also have the Max name for the phones, so why not break them up on the chips? It's a weird naming scheme, I'm not gonna lie, but seeing the specs, it makes sense. So the first processor I wanna talk about is the M1 Pro. Now this is the one that I'm most likely going to get because it's the one that makes the most sense for me and is also still incredibly impressive. So this one has 10 processor cores. We have 8 full high-performance cores and 2 efficiency cores, because keep in mind, this one is not the one that's aiming to be a high-efficiency chip. It still is, but this is the one that's leaning more towards the performance than the efficiency. It's gonna have up to 16 graphics cores, which if you've seen Apple's graphics performance with the fewer cores they've had on the M1 or on the Apple A series chips, 16 cores is a lot, and it's gonna be fast. And of course, 16 neural engine cores. So if you use something that requires machine learning, you've got 16 of those cores to work with. Now they specify up to because depending on the build to order option, there is an 8-core version of this same chip, which I'm fairly certain means that it's gonna be 6x2, so 6 performance and 2 efficiency. But if you opt for the higher chip, you're gonna get a full 10-core chip. Now, Apple did pull the same stupid graph crap that they did last year, but I feel like this year we have a little more context to what the performance is gonna be because knowing how the M1 performs, seeing this graph gives us a little more context because previously we didn't really have a whole lot of numbers to go off of. This year, if the improvements they gave us off the M1 compared to the M1 Pro and Max are anything to go by, I'm super pumped for how these chips are going to perform. Another benefit to the M1 Pro is that we can finally opt for 32 gigabytes of RAM in our Pro systems. This is something that pros have been begging for on the M1, and I wasn't anticipating the M1 standard to get 32 gigabytes of RAM because it's not focused on pros. This is focused mainly on the general consumer. But for professionals, you can finally get 32 gigabytes of RAM at up to 200 gigabytes per second. That is an insane amount of bandwidth for a system on a chip build like this. 32 gigabytes of RAM for video editing is going to be awesome. So whether I get this in the current MacBook Pro they announced, or if I wait and get it in a desktop, 32 gigabytes of RAM is absolutely what I'm going to be getting. Now, it's still not upgradable in any of these systems, but that is kind of the trade-off I feel like they're going for this tight integration with the unified memory architecture, so you kind of have to pick your battles with this one. So between graphics and memory, those are the two things that are going to be different between this Pro model and the Max M1 chip that they announced. So now let's talk about the M1 Max. So for starters, the M1 Max still has the same 10-core architecture. That isn't going to change. What does change is the graphics architecture, which allows for up to 32 cores of graphics performance, which as a video editor, I kind of really like the idea of 32 graphics cores, but something you have to keep in mind is that Apple's system on chips actually leverage encoders for their video editing and rendering as opposed to just raw graphics performance. So for me, I feel like the M1 Pro will be enough because you have those graphics cores alongside the encoders, but I'll have to wait and see. I'm gonna have to think long and hard about that. But yeah, 32 graphics cores, which considering the cores that are in the M1, the cores that are in the A series chips, those are all incredible. 32 of them with room to breathe and keep themselves cool, that's gonna be insane. And on top of that, Apple both doubles the bandwidth and the memory cap of this chip, going with 400 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth and 64 gigabytes of RAM as the maximum amount. That's freaking awesome. Still not upgradable, but again, 400 gigabytes per second of bandwidth at 64 gigabytes of RAM. That is legitimately professional, and it's on an ARM platform. That still is just nuts to me. Now, something Apple casually dropped that I am super excited about, that I'm sure a lot of people are kind of going to gloss over, is the fact that these chips, unlike a lot of gaming laptops I've played with, even unlike my MacBook Pro with the i9, these chips will maintain the same amount of performance on battery as they do on AC power. I'm going to have to go mute a couple devices. But yeah, AC power or battery, same performance. That is so cool. I am actually really excited to try this out, because if you've ever used a gaming laptop before, you know that performance in general just plummets the instant you're on battery. Whereas with this, same performance across the board. I am actually really excited to see how that goes. Now, after Apple announced the 2 chips, this is where I got really excited, but also kind of let down. Like, I've been using the Apple M1 chips since it launched in my Mac Minis, and I even got it in the iPad Pro. So I have no doubt that these chips are going to live up to the expectations and ideally exceed them, because the M1 chip was sort of a cool, it's an iPad chip with some better cooling, and then ended up completely proving all the doubters wrong. So I'm sure this new chip will be that way. The hardware, however, that it's going to be put in is a mixed bag for me. So I'm just going to come right out and say it. I am very disappointed that there were no hardware announcements for desktops at this event. I was really hoping for, I'm still hoping for, a Power Mac G4 Cube spiritual successor of some kind, because that was easily my favorite Mac design of all time. And considering the power efficiency of these new chips and the performance that they pack, I think that they'd be a perfect mix for a mid-ranged performance desktop. But Apple really seems to be sort of pushing the desktop crowd over to the base Mac Mini, which, don't get me wrong, is great, but they seem to be pushing people over to the more consumer side of things for desktops, and then the Pro stuff is crazy high-end like the new Mac Pro, and they seem to want people to look more at mobile solutions like their laptops or their iPads. So yeah, no desktops. That was kind of disappointing, and I was really hoping for the Mac Mini Pro everybody was talking about, or again, the Power Mac G4 Cube successor. However, I couldn't stay too disappointed, because the new MacBook Pro that they announced is basically everything I wanted from the last generation of MacBook Pro and more. Now, there are only a few things I'm not a huge fan of with this new MacBook Pro. One of them is extremely obvious, which is the fact that they put a notch on the screen. So yeah, in order to give us the 2 things we've been asking for as MacBook Pro users, they gave us the thinner bezels and gave us a full 1080p webcam. But to do that, they made a notch. I guess if it's thin enough and it is within the top toolbar, it's not a big deal, but considering they talked about how many more pixels this has over the last generation of MacBook Pro, the fact that some of those pixels appear to go to waste if you do a full screen app function, something about that drives me nuts. And my only other complaint really comes from the fact that a lot of videographers nowadays, myself included, use CF Express as opposed to SD cards. And the fact that Apple added the SD card back is great, but I almost would have preferred they put a CF Express card reader in line with it or in lieu of it, or made it an option so you could either buy one with CF Express or SD, depending on whether you're a photographer or a videographer. And I could kind of nitpick about a few things, like the fact that they told us that the headphone jack is now capable of running high-end headphones, but they didn't tell us what the impedance was. They didn't tell us how many ohms the headphones had to be or what the limit was. They just told us high-end headphones. So hopefully the DAC is powerful enough for some higher resistance headphones. I hope so, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. But that's the end of my complaints. This MacBook Pro, apart from the 3 things I mentioned, has everything I could have asked for in the previous generation MacBook Pro and more. So starting off with the design, this thing is thicker by a little bit, which I'm completely fine with, because the design they chose looks very similar to the classic MacBook Pro design, my personal favorite, which was the 2006 MacBook Pro. It was also the Power Mac design, but this was my favorite design of MacBook ever. And they combined it with what I would consider the most functional MacBook Pro ever, which was the 2013 through 2015 Retina MacBook Pro lineup. This is easily one of the best looking MacBooks to have come out in the past few years. It's not razor thin with only one type of port on it. It didn't go so thin that they had to do a stupid keyboard design. And again, it reminds me of some of the older designs with the functionality of some slightly newer designs. It's a perfect combination, in my opinion, of design and functionality, something that I feel like Apple has been sacrificing in favor of the other. They've been really focusing on design and sacrificing functionality, and this isn't that. Also, before I forget, the keyboard is finally improved. No more touch bar. You have the regular keys up top. It is right in line with what I would consider the best keyboard I've ever used, which was the 2012 through 2015 MacBook Pro Retina model. Freaking great. I'm so glad they brought that back. It took them long enough to realize that nobody wants the touch bar and that the butterfly key switches were hot garbage. So, new keyboard with a black anodized aluminum surrounding. That's kind of neat, and I'm really interested to see how it accents those keys. We have 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, one on one side with the SD card reader and the reintroduced HDMI port, thank God, and the other 2 are on the other side of the MacBook with the headphone jack and the reintroduced MagSafe 3 port. So they brought back easily the best charging option ever with MagSafe. You can still charge your MacBook with the Thunderbolt ports, which is awesome for anybody who's upgrading from a MacBook that charged via USB-C. You can still use that charger, so you could have a spare. They brought back the HDMI port, which is something that I found infinitely useful when I had my old 2012 MacBook Pro. The SD card reader, which, even though I would prefer CF Express, is still very useful when I want to take pictures and just load them really quickly. And they still managed to keep Thunderbolt ports, which at this point I can't see myself living without, so the fact that they're still there is great. The only port that they didn't bring back was USB-A, which I'm really not torn up about because I haven't actually used USB-A in quite a while. Now, when it comes to display options, we do have a 14.2 inch now alongside the 16.2 inch model. They're both liquid Retina XDR with mini LEDs, so the same kind of tech they use in these iPad Pros, which in my experience is an incredible feat when it comes to the contrast, the actual quality, and they're all ProMotion, which is nuts. 120 hertz on one of these? Sign me up now. Resolution-wise, the 14-inch one is 3024 by 1964, and then you have the 16.2 at 1356 by 2234. Not native resolution if you're trying to natively edit 4K, but who edits native 4K on a laptop and expects it to be that kind of resolution with screen space for your tools? I wouldn't really expect that much from any laptop, to be honest, and it's still close enough when you're viewing it in full screen that it really shouldn't matter. Now, what interested me the most out of this new MacBook lineup is that for the first time in a long time, the smaller and larger MacBook Pros have the same performance potential. I think the last time that happened, it was when Apple announced the 12-inch, 15-inch, and 17-inch PowerBooks. Yeah, those had the same performance capabilities in 3 different sizes. This is the first time in a long time, and actually the first time since PowerPC, that you could get the same chips with the same performance, graphics, and RAM in 2 different sized MacBooks. Because previously, if you went with a 13-inch MacBook Pro, you immediately signed away your right to get a graphics card. Whereas in the bigger ones, you could have a discrete graphics chip. Now, everything's integrated. You could have the same graphics in 14-inch or 16-inch. That's huge. The only difference between the 14-inch and the 16-inch models is the battery life and the usable screen space. That's it. That hasn't happened in a very long time. Oh, and speaking of the battery, 17 hours of battery life with video playback on the 14-inch model, 21 hours of video playback on the MacBook Pro 16-inch. Now, obviously, time will tell what the battery life will be when you're doing heavier work, but that's still impressive. Now, pricing is a little rough if you just look at it at the surface level, but considering they're still selling the standard 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 in it, I think that performance-wise, since it's basically the same between the 14 and 16, pricing isn't as bad as it could be. I did a video talking about the Apple tax and how I feel like this is sort of where it goes away, and I don't think I was too far off, but I wasn't quite on point. The 14-inch MacBook Pro starts at $1999. Now that model gets you an 8-core version of the M1 Pro, 14-core GPU, so a lower grade GPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and 512 gigs of storage, which, starting at 512 gigs of storage, is pretty big for Apple with their MacBook Pro lineup, so that's kind of cool. Now the model that I consider to be the most reasonable is actually going to be $2699. That comes with the 10-core M1 Pro with the 16-core graphics chip, 32 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. But I know for a lot of people that's still kind of pricey. I personally don't feel like I would benefit too much from the M1 Max. I think the Pro is going to work better for my workflow if I go this route, but overall not too bad. I think that the builds you can set up with this are pretty awesome. I would highly encourage you head over to Apple's website and just sort of play around with the configurator and find a price to performance ratio that works for you. Now, the 16-inch MacBook Pro does start at $2499. However, your base model starts with the 10-core CPU, 16-core graphics card of the M1 Pro. It also then comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. So generally, you get a little bit more alongside the bigger size for the base model. However, this is the one that I like playing around with the most because you can option this model up to $6,100 if you go for the M1 Max, which is going to be the 32 graphics cores, 10 CPU cores, and you get 64 gigabytes of RAM and an 8 terabyte SSD. You can actually get that with this. It's kind of nuts. But if you were to look for something that is more reasonable out of this lineup, you could go with the M1 Max if you're looking for the highest grade setup. You could get 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD, which if you opt for the M1 Max version of this is what you start with, and that runs for $34.99. I'm not going to go through every single build, but I feel like if you want the most powerful, biggest MacBook Pro, which is how I used to be, you could get a full setup like this for $34.99. Expensive, yes, but until we see the performance figures, I'm going to say that this M1 Max is probably going to be a performance equivalent to something like a 3060 combo with an i9 processor inside of like a gaming laptop. We'll see if that's true, but I do feel like knowing what the performance of my M1 is like and seeing the 70% faster, 2 times the graphics, all that kind of stuff, seeing those numbers gives me a pretty solid idea of where this is going to sit, and it's going to be big. So overall, I can't speak so much for what the day-to-day use is going to be until I get my hands on one to try it out, but generally, these MacBooks are really impressive in my opinion. The fact that now we can have the same performance in a small or large version for those who want to travel or those who want a bigger machine, and just generally the performance out of the M1, comparing that to the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, and seeing the 70% faster figures and all that stuff really gets me excited for what we can see in these new models coming out, but also what we can expect in the future. If this is what they're pulling off in a laptop chassis, what are they going to be able to pull off when they have more breathing room with a desktop? They've already shown that a desktop with a lot of breathing room can keep the M1 consistently fast with zero noise. So time will tell what this is going to turn into. But for now, we have a brand new lineup of MacBook Pros that are designed in a way that really invokes my favorite era of design from Apple, but also brings the functionality of personally my most functional MacBook I've ever owned, and slaps it into one hybrid that, while it does have a notch, and I think that is kind of ugly, is probably going to be the best MacBook for, gosh, the next few years at least. I'm done ranting. I think that what they've come out with is really impressive. This is easily the best MacBook I've seen out of these guys in years. And considering the kind of videos they showed off, while they were obviously very scripted, showing some of the stuff they were able to pull off on a laptop really inspires confidence in what we're going to be seeing in the next few years. So hopefully this is the start of something really good. I have a lot of thinking to do on whether I'm going to opt for going back to a laptop setup in a docking configuration, or if I'm going to wait for a desktop configuration. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the last video. If you watched this one first, I did another one. You can check it out over there. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you all in the next video. Yeah, that's it. Have a good one.